Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to present a talk about are we witnessing the emergence of a new global psychiatric power? Essentially, what I'm going to ask is, are we witnessing the emergence of globalization and of psychiatrization of society at the same time, and what's the relationship between these two? And I will take a chance to start from a recent a recent piece from a talk show by CNN that this was broadcasted just on the 25th of August. It actually reproduces the kind of dialogue that I imagined in my abstract between the duty to warn movement, if you are familiar with it, so the people who say Trump has a mental health condition, or even if he doesn't, he's dangerous on grounds of mental health. And on the other side, Dr. Alan Francis, former chair of the DSM-4, who has a slightly different view of this. So let me show you. And I would ask you to please try to pay attention to the language, that they use. Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
And then just click out of it.
So something's wrong.
Where?
There are lots of theories about what it is. There are some doctors who think they know. There are others who say we shouldn't speculate.
Oh, sorry.
So something's wrong. There are lots of theories about what it is. There are some doctors who think they know. There are others who say we shouldn't speculate. There are ethical questions about even having this conversation at all. But we can't tiptoe around it anymore. We've got to talk about this. So let's talk about it. Let's do it. Let me bring in two guests, two psychiatrists with differing views about this. Dr. Biennial is a professor at the Yale School of Medicine. She co-authored and edited the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Originally came out 2 years ago. She started this conversation in many ways about Trump's mental health. And Dr. Alan Francis is in Philly for us. He's a professor emeritus and former chair at psychiatry at Duke University Medical College. And he authored the book, Twilight of American Sanity, A Psychiatrist Analyzes the Age of Trump. So Dr. Lee, first to you. You have been trying to sound an alarm for the past 2 years about the president's fitness. Has the press been listening to what you and your colleagues have been saying?
Not at all. I feel that the press has actively tried to shun us, especially the New York Times editorial that seems to have been published in collaboration with the past APA president. And I've been very concerned about the fact that the American Psychiatric Association has been working as pretty much as an agent of the state to modify...
What, to stop people from talking about this issue?
Yes, I'm speaking of the new, what many of us have started to call a gag rule. They have modified the original Goldwater rule, which I'm a staunch supporter of, into an order that allows for no exception, and it basically says that we're not just allowed to diagnose, but to say anything of any kind in relation to a public figure. Here's what the original Goldwater rule says, that psychiatrists have a responsibility to society as well as to patients, and we are expected to contribute to activities that improve the community and better public health. And so when we're asked about a public figure, we should educate the public in general terms, just not diagnose.
Right, without saying, I'm diagnosing, because you've never met the man.
Exactly.
You can describe what you're seeing. So Dr. Francis, I know you disagree with this view that Dr. Lee and a couple other dozen psychiatrists have published in this book. You say it's dangerous to be talking this way. Why?
Well, I think that medicalizing politics has three very dire consequences. The first is that it stigmatizes the mentally ill. I've known thousands of patients, almost all of them have been well-behaved, well-mannered, good people. Trump is none of these. Lumping the mentally ill with Trump is a terrible insult to the mentally ill, and they have enough problems and stigma as it is. The second issue is that calling Trump crazy hides the fact that we're crazy for having elected him, and even crazier for allowing his crazy policies to persist. Trump is as destructive a person in this century as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were in the last century. He may be responsible for many more million deaths than they were. He needs to be contained, but he needs to be contained by attacking his policies, not his person. It's crazy for us to be destroying the climate our children will live in. It's crazy to be giving tax cuts to the rich that will add trillions of dollars to the debt our children will have to pay. It's crazy to be destroying our democracy by claiming that the press and the courts are the enemy of the people. We have to face these policies, not Trump's person. Now, it's absolutely impossible. You can bet the House that the Congress, that Pence, that the cabinet will never, ever remove Trump on grounds of mental unfitness. That will never happen. Discussing the issue in psychological name-calling terms distracts us from getting out the vote. And the important thing is to get Trump out of office.
I'm talking about asking questions that are really uncomfortable. I'm not saying we have the answers. I'm saying we need to bring it up.
Okay, so let's try to bring it up. I hope you noticed the language that they used. So on one side we have Dr. Lee. She is the editor of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is a book with 37 authors. I actually worked with some of them in the past. And we have another book, which is Dr. Francis' one, Twilight of American Sanity, a psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump. Now, essentially what they say is he has a mental health condition and is dangerous, and what he answers is that no, the voters who actually put him in that position are actually crazy. And he actually used the word crazy 7 times, if you noted. But I would say he used it in a metaphorical way, at least 6 out of the 7, depending how you count. And then he mentioned psychological name calling. Okay, so I will try to analyze language a little bit. So this is an outline, seen in video, then I will analyze language a bit. I will try to draw a parallel between the current psychiatrization of Trump and what happened with the psychiatrization of King George III of England at a really critical time when there was the birth of psychiatry and when there were the French and American revolutions. And I mean, according to Foucault, at this time we moved from, there was this paradigm shift between from sovereign power to what he calls disciplinary power. And finally, I will just mention, if I have time, just a little bit of context. Okay, so from figurative language, technical language, with analogies and metaphors, to literal technical language. And also there is another movement that sometimes is not very visible, it's kind of implied. When we discuss political issues in psychological or psychiatric or psychoanalytic terms, and sometimes we don't see that sort of movement. So I would say there are 3 kinds of spaces: the political space and language, technical language used metaphorically, with analogies, with figures of speech, and the technical language that is meant to be literal. So we can see that in the very first memoir of Philippe Pinel, widely considered to be the father of psychiatry, he actually mentions the word analogie. So he says that one cannot ignore a striking analogy. Who's that? Oh, thank you. One cannot ignore a striking analogy in nature's ways when one compares the attacks of intermittent insanity with violent symptoms of an acute illness. So he's the first, it was not Thomas Szasz the first, he's the first who drew a sort of analogy. That analogy was open for inspection and for further analysis for a long time now. So, and this document is considered, even by the person Dora Wiener, who translated it and published it in the American Journal of Psychiatry, to be a political document as well, because he presented it. This was the first presentation of his new method, for which he is famous, which he called régime moral. Sometimes this is translated as psychological treatment. I'm not sure if I would go with that, or with mental management. Let's keep in mind that at the time, the French Revolution just destroyed the so-called ancien régime. So régime moral was not a neutral word, regime. And also in the same paper, he uses the word terror referred to patients. And that was actually the year of terror in Paris. So I would question this kind of translations, a kind of neutral kind of, psychological treatment kind of. And he presented it at a revolutionary audience at the Society for Natural History, which voted to forward this memoir to the Committee on Public Safety. So it was a political document, really. So Thomas Szasz, much later, he wrote The Myth of Mental Illness in 1960, if I'm not mistaken. And then later on, this is his final formulation. Mental illness is a metaphor. He says metaphorical disease. Now, by disease, I wouldn't entirely agree with that. I don't want to go back into this kind of discussion, but I'm just presenting it. Because a disease is a biological condition. You need to have someone like a pathologist to diagnose a disease. If it's a functional disease, it's a little bit more blurred. But an illness implies subjective kind of suffering. So I would think mental illness exists. The problem that was mentioned before is when we talk about illness, are we implying that there is an underlying disease? That's something that usually goes kind of unexamined. So the word disease, this is Szasz again, denotes a demonstrable biological process that affects the bodies of living organisms. The term mental illness refers to undesirable thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of persons. So individuals with mental diseases, bad behaviors, like societies with economic diseases, bad fiscal policies, and we can all say that this is a safe analogy, right, are metaphorically sick. We might disagree on this, but this was the kind of safe analogy for him. Everybody would agree that this is an analogy. Some people are questioning that nowadays. So the classification of misbehavior as illness provides an ideological justification for state-sponsored social control as medical treatment. So nowadays, there are people, this is a project based in London, the Collective Psychology Project, a larger us, 2019. Essentially, they are trying, this is my reading of it, among other things, to frame this metaphor as if it's literally, technically real. Because, in essence, people experience fears and anxieties and anger, and those can be characterized as pathological, and those can spread by education. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm an epidemiologist. Those can spread like an epidemic. So maybe through direct contact or through a source of contagion, which could be a source of fake news, for instance, or maybe through social media. Okay, so in essence they say, politics meets psychology. Once threat perception starts to take root in politics, it's contagious. We usually think of issues in the world, climate breakdown, mass extinction, hyper inequality, struggles to heal long legacies of racism and discrimination in a different category from mental health issues. The inner and outer crises we face are closely linked. Instead of addressing real-world issues, we are using precious political bandwidth to measure polarization itself, the parliamentary stalemates, congressional shutdowns. Democracy only works if enough of us can manage our mental and emotional states. If we can, then we are wide open to manipulation by unseen actors who can nudge us to see the world in the them and us terms. So I'm not interested in the old polemic. I'm interested in the fact that now the literal sense slowly is moving. So, and if you check the fact that Dr. Francis, even if he questioned the fact that Donald Trump might not be mentally ill or that we shouldn't characterize him like that, he used a lot of metaphors in mental health. So my argument is that he moved from political language to metaphorical psychological language, and other people like Dr. Lee might actually want us to move, or like these kind of people here, they are close to the Open Democracy Network. They want to move even the collective phenomena that once were considered to be safe metaphors. Dr. Francis actually mentions bad fiscal policies of Trump, so tax cuts for the rich. Now they are increasingly presented as if they are literally societal diseases, like epidemics of mental illness or something like that. Okay, so historian Hobsbawm in The Age of Revolution said, with few exceptions, all the thinkers of importance in our period spoke the secular language, whatever their private religious belief. And he was talking about the enlightened scholars of the late 18th century. So language precedes other kind of changes in beliefs. So it's really important to take a look at language. So we moved from religious language to secular language before many other things moved in the direction of becoming secular, in a sense. Okay, I'm going to be very quick with this. This is George Orwell, Politics and the English Language. Essentially, he was lamenting the fact in 1945 that English language is in a bad way. We generally assume that this is almost like a natural phenomenon. Any struggles against this are seen as sentimental kind of archaisms. And he said, it is clear that the decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. And then bad language itself is going to make things worse. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. The point is that the process is reversible in his view. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia, he said. I would question that all issues are political issues might be a sort of insidious concept, because when everything is political, nothing is political. So the word itself is losing its meaning a little bit. Okay, this is a historian and social critic, Christopher Lasch. He's famous for a book, The Society of Narcissism. I hope that the title is exactly this one. But he also wrote another one, The Revolt of the Elites. This was his last one. It was published posthumous. The Betrayal of Democracy. So essentially, he's saying it is debate itself and debate alone that gives rise to the desire for usable information in people. And also he said, having been excluded from public debate on the grounds of their incompetence, most Americans are actually becoming incompetent. And then he says that characterizing someone with labels such as Eurocentric, racist, sexist, homophobic, and others, or xenophobic, he said the culture wars, and he was also referring to identity politics, that have convulsed America since the 60s are best understood as a form of class warfare in which an enlightened elite, as it thinks of itself, seeks not so much to impose its values on the majority, a majority perceived as incorrigibly racist, sexist, provincial, and xenophobic, much less to persuade the majority by means of rational public debate. So he was criticizing the use of this sort of language as well, and of identity politics. So, the use of psychological name-calling, as Dr. Francis said, I would call it ideopathological lexicon, from ideological and pathological, or in short, sci-speak. Some general examples about phobias: xenophobia, homophobia, progressophobia, Islamophobia, Masonophobia, Afrophobia, oikophobia. Among the philias, tyrannophilias. Both progressophobia and tyrannophilia are used by Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who, by the way, was a professor of mine, in his latest book, Enlightenment Now. Another one, Afrophobia, has been recently used, this year actually, in a European Parliament resolution. Another one, oikophobia, was coined by a conservative political philosopher, Roger Scruton, and so on. Then we have other terms. These have all been used for Trump. Narcissist, pathological narcissist, sociopath, obsessive, compulsive, anxious, paranoid, conspiracy theorist, angry, autistic, we just discussed, etc. Okay, so I'm trying to rush. Okay, so what are the effects of this kind of ideopathological lexicon? I would argue it's individualization, problems from group problems and collective problems become individual, internalization from polis to psyche, from external causes to internal ones, subjectivization and emotionalization, from cognition and a discourse on objective reality, we are moving to emotion and subjective feelings, or from understanding and possessing to feeling and experiencing. So we also have de-politicization, which was kind of lamented by Christopher Lasch, in a sense. From politics, community, society, economics, we move to a neuropsychiatric behavioral kind of discourse. Also, these kind of lexicon can be seen as moving the discourse from discussing to labeling, sort of weaponized political parlance. Or from an active citizen, we could move to a passive patient. Why patient? Because usually the diagnosis is done by anybody. You can tell someone like, I think you are xenophobic, which doesn't mean you are against immigration. You are kind of labeling this person. So you are assuming the expert gaze, in a sense. Okay. So I try to make this comparison between using the anti-words and the phobic words. So you have character A and character B. Character A is telling to character B, you are anti-communist, for instance. And character B is answering with, no, it's you, you are xenophobic. I would argue this is from cognition to cognition, and this is from cognition to, emotion, fears, phobias. And if we compare them on general terms, the anti-lexicon is higher in terms of cognition, and it refers to the outer world. Phobic, lower and inner. This person is in control. The phobic person is out of control. This is cognitive conscious versus emotional sub-unconscious or kind of automatic. Political and content-oriented, psychopathological and messenger-oriented. Dignifying to some extent, depending on the word, despite strong disagreement, while the other one tends to be undignifying, stigmatizing, and labeling. Discussion, this is part of the discussion, it's more democratic. The other one is, it kind of disincentivizes discussion, less democratic, in the less sense of, discussion being the kind of fabric of democracy. This is about objective facts. The other one is about subjective states. This stimulates outward reflection. The other one stimulates inward self-reflection of the other person, not of yourself, if you use this kind of lexicon, of the person who is the target of it. Okay. So Schopenhauer made a distinction between argumentum. So if this is the fabric of democracy, it can be ad rem, ad hominem, ad auditores, ad personam. We could add a fifth one, ad psychem. So this is about things and about the truth. This is about other statements people have made or about the way people live. For instance, oh, you are a communist, but you're living in luxury. That's an example. Ad auditores, the argument is invalid, but it sounds valid to the audience. And ad personam is usual name calling. But this is technical or quasi-technical or psychological name calling, as Dr. Francis mentioned. So pseudo-quasi-technical name calling. So the citizens are assuming the expert gaze, the expert psychopathological gaze. Okay. Specific examples. Recently, Professor Sir Roger Scruton claimed that the term Islamophobia, right or wrong, was coined by the Muslim Brotherhood to inhibit discussion on Islam. He also mentioned another couple of things about anger in China, and he was immediately fired from chairing a governmental committee for this. Recently, at a meeting in London, very interesting meeting, I saw this word anti-homophobic in a presentation. I asked about this word, and it was clarified that it referred to activists and scholars who fought against and critically examined homophobia. But as you can see, this implies a conscious or rational decision on the person who is anti. It doesn't do the same on the target. So this person is characterized as anti-homophobic, not as homophobic-phobic, for instance. Then exceptions. Anti-democratic, anti-Semite, and anti-psychiatrist are usually inherently seen as negative or labeling. Anti-fascist is usually seen with a positive connotation. Anti-communist or anti-religious can be used either ways. Are there any exceptions for the phobic terms? Are they ever used positively? Or are they ever used to imply that this kind of fear, we know that fear and anxiety are normal states. And are these terms ever meant to be, oh, yeah, you are, I don't know, xenophobic, but just in the right amount? I don't think so. They're usually used to imply some sort of pathology. Okay, and usually they are part of what we would call political correctness, broadly speaking. So if we consider this kind of lexicon, is this a biopolitic in the Foucauldian term, a psychopolitic? When we mix this kind of concepts, we can come up with some sort of paradoxical effects. We might be moving from mental health and political correctness to mental correctness and political health. So not meant anymore as a metaphor, but meant as a like literal political health, and maybe not politics anymore. Okay, so the most powerful man in the world, head of the British Empire at the time, most high democratically elected officer nowadays, the 45th president of the United States of America, Donald Trump. So in this fantastic book by Foucault, Psychiatric Power, it's a series of lectures at the Collège de France. He said that obviously you know what passes for the great founding scene of modern psychiatry, Biennial liberating, the mad. However, he's suggesting that the founding scene of psychiatry is really the psychiatrization of King George III, which also marked, in his view, the birth of what he calls disciplinary power. So we are moving from sovereign power to disciplinary power. So in Foucault's view, this scene is a landmark for both of these things, one related to power, one related to psychiatry. So I don't think I have time to read, unfortunately, Biennial's text. In essence, he's describing how the king, the person directing the treatment, tells him that he's no longer sovereign, but that he must henceforth be obedient and submissive. And then this kind of power is considered to be sort of anonymous and disciplinary, as the word says. And so, and there is a scene that is kind of the opposite of a coronation ceremony. It's an inverse coronation ceremony. So this is Biennial liberating the mad, but according to Foucault, this is the founding scene. The inverse of a coronation ceremony. Okay, so can we see any historical patterns as in A Revolution in History, historian of psychiatry Roy Porter asked? Okay, so psychiatricizing either presidential candidates or presidents is not new. This is Goldwater, which gave the name to the Goldwater rule, and that is Madness of King George, but that's George W. Bush. Okay. So in the first book of the two, in that sort of, I would take a single sentence from economist Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist. Okay, so this is demedicalized. Those who pretend that we are in the realm of politics when we are really in the realm of psychopathology make the situation even more dangerous, he's telling us, because they will not be prepared while the future of the planet and the human race are at stake. So I would argue that the psychiatrization of Trump is not just about Trump. It's about the larger psychiatrization of society, as this kind of statements, the book is full of them, imply. And I would argue that what Alan Francis replies plays in the same direction, really. Trump is in case we are, so who is the new sovereign in the democratic world? Is the citizen. What's the difference between the time of George III and nowadays? There are mass media, there are digital social media. We constantly watch this kind of stuff as if it's a sort of reality TV. Trump is not new to reality TV. Unfortunately, the consequences of what he does might be extremely real and serious, but the kind of representation is for us. We get desovereignized because we watch this spectacle. Look who you have elected. So, and actually, this is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. So you see the discourse is spreading. It's not just Trump. United Kingdom has gone mad. The problem with holding out for the purpose of Brexit plan is that you can fix stupid. And he said that Britain is a ship of fools and all of this kind of stuff. So this is the discourse. It's not just about Trump. This is my hypothesis. In 2018, British Journal of Psychiatry, is it ethical to diagnose a public figure? This is a very good paper. I would highly recommend it. So one of the founders of the Duty to War movement said, yes, it's ethical. And also he said something very interesting, that you don't need a psychiatric interview to make a diagnosis. He says that the psychiatric interview is actually misleading. That if you use existing facts, or I would say existing data, you get a more accurate diagnosis according to this view. And he makes a sort of appeal to the concept of revolution as well. A quote commonly attributed to Orwell goes, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. actually it is a fake quote because Orwell never said that, so it's a very interesting thing. He's talking about the truth using a fake quote. Truth does not defend itself, and brave psychiatric revolutionaries seem to be in short supply. Okay, so this is Italian psychiatrist Jervis, who, talking about the generals of the Vietnam War, made, I think, a very valid point, which we can apply to Trump as well. It is appropriate to consider with suspicion that the thesis advanced by certain supporters of anti-psychiatry, such as Lane, when they affirm that the warmongering American generals are more dangerously mad than an individual admitted to a madhouse with a diagnosis of psychosis. To attribute the behavior of generals or of the imperialists to a sort of monstrous irrationality commonly accepted as normal means not allowing oneself to consider that the logic of war or of the bomb or of anger is not the result of particular psychological processes, but of a social system which is neither mad nor irrational and simply defends with maximum coherence some vested interests. I would actually agree with that. I will skip this, but this was very interesting nonetheless. I would just cite this. This is a book which I highly recommend by Amir Brzezinski, written in 1969 and published the following year, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. In this book, he's linking, in 69, globalization, a lot of psychological language is full of it. And he mentions this. Nationalism so personalized community feelings that the nation became an extension of the ego. Think about the rhetoric of the psychedelic Renaissance movement. What do psychedelics or hallucinogens do? Ego dissolution, ego death. These people are globalists. The nation is an extension of the ego. Okay, so national identity, the doctrine of sovereignty, sovereign, created the institutional basis for challenging the secular authority of established religion, and this challenge in turn paved the way for the emergence of the abstract concept of nation-state. So sovereignty vested in people instead of sovereignty vested in the king. The French and American revolutions radically altered the structure of authority in the West and prepared the ground for a new dominant concept of reality. Okay, so we have discussed some of these comparison, sovereign monarch, democratically elected, and we are the ones who, in my view, according to my hypothesis, if you will, who are those who should receive the message. We are easily manipulable. We are by the ongoing kind of rhetoric, increasingly encouraged to experience, not to think. We are not good at thinking, but we are very good at experiencing. So in this way, we are being desovereignized. So what's coming next? We don't know. This has been called the post-industrial or technotronic or digital or automation revolution. We have psychedelic renaissance. According to Steven Pinker, we should have a new enlightenment. And we are in a post-democratic phase. Some people call it epistocracy, which means that we should vote with the vote weighted by knowledge. So not everybody has the same weight. Maybe technocracy, maybe scientific dictatorship or technofascism, who knows? So these theories come from far. We have the book already mentioned, The Crisis of Democracy, the other book already mentioned by Lash, more recent ones, How Democracy Ends, or Against Democracy, which is advocating for epistocracy, a vote weighted by knowledge. So very quickly, this idea of a depoliticized citizen comes from far away. London, 1948, International Congress on Mental Health. If you think about it, depoliticized citizen is a contradiction in terms, because citizen comes from city, politics come from polis. So, and if you look in any reliable source, the concept of citizenship is a strongly political term. But in this document, they say that the idea of word citizen, as here conceived, is not used in a political sense. Actually, after coming to this conclusion, I found this document that I find quite interesting. The question of a word political sovereignty replacing and embracing the sovereignties of existing nations is not the topic of this document, but it may come. That's what they concluded. Okay. Mental hygiene and mental health movements. Essentially, with the World Health Organization Constitution, we have since 1946, a positive definition of health, including mental health, which sounds really good, right? So it's not just the absence of disease, it's something more than that. But this kind of operation implies that there is no upper limit to the reach of health and of mental health. So they can extend maybe even to politics. So there is no upper limit. And someone at the WHO recently analyzing the history of the concept of mental health in World Psychiatry, so a pretty mainstream publication in the field. More than a scientific discipline, mental health is a political and ideological movement, he concluded. Okay, recently global mental health was discussed at the World Economic Forum. This is how the World Economic Forum sees mental health related with continuous monitoring, digital, with economic concepts, with political concepts. If this was not from the World Economic Forum, I would think this is someone with an hyperactive dopaminergic system with all of these connections. But anyway, so finally, nowadays we have digital phenotyping. Thomas Insel, who is a psychiatrist, he was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for about 15 years. Then he moved to Google, and now he has his own startup in California. He was an expert in animal studies about the social brain. So he's an expert in oxytocin and vasopressin, and now he's dealing with digital phenotype. And he says in 2050, looking backwards, perhaps the revolution in technology and information science will prove the most consequential, if you read this as well, for global mental health. Okay, finally, a final quote. Benjamin Rush, he was an American revolutionary and the father of American psychiatry for almost a century on the logo of American psychiatry. And in writing to the second president of the United States, John Adams, in his late years, he said this: "There was a time when these things irritated and distressed me, but I now hear and see them with the same indifference or pity that I hear the ravings and witness the antique gestures of my deranged patients in our hospital. We often hear of prisoners at large. The majority of mankind are madmen at large. Were we to live our lives over again and engage in the same benevolent enterprise, the American Revolution, our means should be not reasoning, but bleeding, purging, low diet, and the tranquilizing chair," which, by the way, he invented. So, are we moving from the tranquilizing chair to virtual reality, sensory deprivation, and coercion? And this is non-coercive, sensory overstimulation. So, and this is more sort of, cooptative, if you will. So I would leave you with that. Thank you for your attention. My take about the difference between the clinical use and the societal or political use of some of these psychopathological concepts is that in a clinical context, they are meant not to be stigmatizing or to be as non-stigmatizing as possible, right? So some people would argue that they are stigmatizing anyway, as it has been kind of discussed. But when used in the political arena, I'm not sure if different terms might lend themselves more or less to this kind of political use, whether they are biological in nature or whether they are less so, like personality disorders, for instance. So when they're used in the political sense, if you consider Thomas Friedman an article in the New York Times, that's clearly stigmatizing. So those kind of expressions are clearly stigmatizing. But I would bet that if I meet Thomas Friedman and I ask him, what do you think about destigmatizing mental illness? Oh, that's a wonderful thing. So why do you write those kind of articles? So there is this sort of dual use or hypocritical use of these terms in the clinical context, and we don't want them to be stigmatizing, so there are the destigmatization campaigns for this, but they are used in a stigmatizing sense when used politically. Maybe it's similar to what George Orwell called a kind of double think. Use one term with two different meanings at the same time, which is a sort of schizophrenic kind of thing. And actually recently on Italian TV, I saw a debate And there was a journalist arguing against immigration, and there was a famous Italian doctor arguing that we should not do anything to stop it. And then this doctor told this person, you should go to a psychiatric doctor straight away, duty psychiatric doctor. And this journalist said, why are you becoming offensive? And he said, I'm not offensive. I'm just telling you to go to a doctor. This is medicine. This is not an offense. So you can see that this is, in my view, kind of double think. You want it to be offensive, but at the same time you deny that. So this is kind of my take about this use of the terms in the clinical versus the political or societal.